very destructive disease of apples, but more so of pears. For example, in Michigan in 2000, 220,000 apple trees of 2 to 5 years of age were killed by Fireblight. That's 240 hectares of orchards lost at a cost of $42 million. So in the right conditions, it can be a really serious problem. Fortunately, at the moment in the UK, it's a very sporadic disease. And for example, the last serious outbreak on apple trees was in 1984. So it's probably before some of you were even born. So it's often overlooked as a problem, and because there aren't any chemical control measures, it really needs special attention as to how you deal with it. It has a range of hosts, mostly in the rosaceous types. On apple, Gala, Brayburn, Fuji, John O'Gold, Egremont, Russet, James Grieve, Ida Red are particularly susceptible, as are the late flowering cider apples, Bilberry and Brown Snout. Pears, of course, Perry pears, are particularly susceptible to it, and Malus rootstocks, M9 and M26 are particularly susceptible. So I think most cider apples are still on M106, so less susceptible from that point of view. But the important thing is young apple and pear trees at most at risk. Other hosts, hawthorn, particularly good host, and you can get reservoirs of infection in hawthorn hedgerows, but also white bean, mountain ash, and ornamentals such as Coleaster, Pyracantha and Stranvesia. But the actual host risk is very much dependent on the seasonal weather conditions. Because we're in a marginal place for Fireblight, it likes much hotter climates. To get good infection, you need the host to be at the right growth stage, i.e. blossom or soft shoot growth, and that's got to coincide with the presence of Fireblight in the area, and also very favourable weather. So you've got to have all of those things together to get a really good epidemic, if you like. So those things are dependent, as well as the actual inherent susceptibility of your plant. I've got some symptoms here which you can pass around and look, or we'll stick up over there for you to look at later. But basically you get various symptoms depending on the time of the year. In the spring and summer, the common infections are on flowers and young fruitlets, and basically the Fireblight kills the blossoms, and then it's characteristic that because it's a bacteria, you get ooze, creamy coloured ooze in wet weather on the dead blossoms. And the blossoms, the Fireblight then progresses from the dead blossom into the shoot, and then forms a nicer canker on the branch. Fireblight cankers, this is how it overwinters, and these can be quite small cankers on branches or even larger cankers on the trunk, and these will also produce ooze. The shoot infections are very characteristic because you get the typical hooked over shoot, the crooked shoot, and that's very characteristic. And even before the shoot starts to die back, you can see droplets of ooze along the crooked top of the shoot. And then you get the massive dieback of the shoots. Now normally on apple trees, and mature apple trees, you get the infection of the shoot, but it goes so far back into the branch and then it stops. So on mature apple trees, it can look pretty devastating, but it usually doesn't kill the tree. Mature pear trees, on the other hand, they're much more susceptible, and you can get infection going through a shoot, progressing right down the branch into the main trunk, and it can kill a mature pear tree under the right conditions in a few days. So pear's much more susceptible. The problem with on young apple trees is that you've got very susceptible tissue, nice lush growth, so the infection can go in through a shoot, and because it's only a small tree, it can go right down into the trunk. And once it's in the main stem, the apple tree is basically only suitable for the bonfire. There's no point trying to save the tree when the Fireblight's progressed to the trunk. You can also get fruit infection, and on fruit, initially it looks like a bruised apple, but then under the right conditions, you'll start to see the bacterial ooze on the broods. So you can also see it on actual fruit. Just to confuse you, the symptoms you get with Fireblight can look very similar to other diseases, other fungal diseases. For instance, when you get the dead blossoms, that can resemble blossom wilt, Monolinia laxa, which also progresses back from the dead blossom into the shoot, but you won't see any ooze with that, and on the shoot you'll see tiger striping where the fungus is progressing down the shoot. In the, I can't remember what it's called, the cider growers book that we recently updated, in there you'll find a table of things that cause dead blossoms on apple trees, and as well as there's Fireblight there's blossom wilt, there's a nectaria canker, and there's also bud moth, and all of those basically cause dead blossoms, and it tells you in there how to distinguish between the different types of different causes. The symptoms on the other hosts, the hawthorn, cotoneaster, all of those things are pretty much the same. You basically can see dead blossoms, dieback and cankers, but it's all basically the same with ooze. Sort of a short disease cycle. The fungus will overwinter in the dead blossoms or the cankers. They'll start producing ooze under warm, wet weather in the spring. The ooze is spread by either by insects or by rain and wind to blossoms. Those will be killed, and then the ooze from that will spread eventually onto the shoot growth in the summer, and then that will die back to form the cankers again. But how much of that happens, I mean, in a country which is very hot to where the conditions are ideal for Fireblight, you'll see that cycle going on all the time in the orchard. But the trouble with the UK is because it's marginal for this disease, and you have to have exactly the right conditions for it all to happen. You might find that conditions were favourable in the spring for a little bit of blossom infection, and then because after that it's not favourable, it will stop. So what you'll get on the tree is maybe a couple of dead blossoms and nothing else. And then you get on into the summer, you'll have the warm, wet conditions that we've had recently with rain, and the whole thing will start again. That will start oozing and will produce a source of infection for lush shoot growth. So in this country you can get infections that occur in the spring that are completely missed, and then those are a source of inoculum for producing the shoot growth, and it's the shoot infection. It's probably the shoot infection which is the most spectacular because you get massive dieback and it's very visible. But where this year's infection has come from, certainly on some trees you can see dead blossoms, so it probably started off in the spring, did nothing and sat there until the summer when we've had all the heavy rain and wind. That's when it's got into the shoots and caused a massive infection. But it also could have happened last autumn, because we had, if you remember, last September, October 2011, we had a very warm, wet period, the end of September, beginning of October, and you could get Fireblight infection occurring at that time, and that can remain symptomless on the tree, and again start up again the following season. So there's lots of possibilities how it got in, but why it's showing up now is basically because we've got trees, especially young trees, with lush shoot growth, and we've had lots of heavy rain and wind assistance, which is sufficient to damage the shoots to get the Fireblight in. So weather conditions, anything that promotes rapid shoot growth is good for it. Favourable temperatures above 18 and up to 30 degrees centigrade, so you can tell it's a disease of warmer climates really. You've got to have free water on the host surface for infection, but that can equally be dew as well as rain. And any strong winds or hail that are going to damage the host tissue also increases the risk. You can skip a lot of this. So let's see. So factors that increase risk, obviously infection in hawthorn hedgerows, or even on ornamental shrubs in gardens adjacent to orchards. These are sufficient to be sources of inoculum. And there's plenty of studies done on looking at the incidence of Fireblight in orchards where you've got an infected hawthorn hedge at one end and you've got the wind coming from behind the hedge, blowing the inoculum into the orchard, and there's plenty of studies to show that the infection that occurs in the orchard can relate back to the hawthorn hedge. So a very important source of inoculum. What increases the risk also is if you have very warm periods in the primary blossom period, so when you've got most of the blossom happening in April or May. And if you remember, this year we had some very warm weather earlier on, and in 2007 we had very hot weather in April. And in 2007, the following year in Kent, we had lots of problems on young apple trees resulting from that previous warm blossom period. And if you've got overlapping blossom periods, so if you've got pear, apple and hawthorn and other ornamentals all flowering at the same time, then that also can increase the risk, because if you've got infected trees, you've got lots of potential for bees to spread the infection. And also bees are one of the main insects that spread the infection around, because obviously they visit lots of blossoms, and if they've come from an infected one, it's a good way of spreading it. And the other big thing that increases the risk is basically complacency. Because we don't have the disease very often, I mean, there's always, every year, somebody will have a small problem with fireblight. It's not often you get lots of fireblight everywhere. And because you don't see it very often, people forget about it. They might see a little bit of infection, it's missed, and then you get the right conditions we had last year, it can suddenly blow up into a massive problem. So once you've had the problem on your farm, you've then got to start thinking about how you're going to monitor it and deal with it each year. So, as I said, basically there are no chemicals to control fireblight. In other countries they use antibiotic sprays, which they would never allow in this country. So really what you're looking for is monitoring the situation, and as soon as you see any infection, cutting it out as soon as possible. So it's, once you've had the problem on the farm, you've really got to walk your orchards, particularly the young orchards, to spot the infection early and deal with it. And particularly also pay attention to hawthorn hedgerows and any susceptible ornamentals in the gardens. Skip that bit. So really, in terms of prevention, it's vigilance really. If you're planting a new orchard, don't plant hawthorn around it, plant something else. Existing hawthorns, you need to keep them well trimmed to prevent flowering. I mean, some of these control measures here relate more to dessert orchards where they have a large workforce to deal with the problem. Yes, and try and avoid soft shoot growth by over-irrigation, poor drainage or excessive nitrogen. So, from the control point of view, make sure you know what fireblight looks like. Then you need to carry out routine inspections at key times, so after leaf fall. And after leaf fall, you'll find that fireblight infected shoots usually have the leaves still stuck on them, so they stand out very obvious. During winter pruning, look out for any signs of dead branches. Soon after bud break, because bits of the tree that have been killed by fireblight, obviously the rest of the tree will break bud and this bit will be not growing, so that's one to check. Mid-June, this is looking for any flower infection after blossom, and late July, August, this is looking for shoot infection. Very important to inspect young trees more frequently, and you need to have additional inspections, especially if you get a lot of frost damage in bloom, after damaging storms, and if there've been local reports of fireblight elsewhere, you can go and you know that's likely to be around. Cutting out the infection, you need to cut well down below the infected part, and you need to, when you're looking for where these infections stops, you need to start in the healthy tissue with your knife and cut up the branch until you come to the brown, and then you need to cut out, I think it says in that handout over there, at least a foot below the infected part to make sure that you're well away from it. So you can see in a young tree where you've got the shoots just go back to the trunk. If you've got the infection spread that far back, then you've really got to get rid of the tree. And it's very important to sterilise your pruning saws and secateurs. suitable disinfectants are Hycolin and Clearsol. I think you get those from veterinary places. An important thing is that you need to wipe the blade with the insecticide in the cloth, because you need to remove any debris off the saw blade or the secateurs. Just dipping it isn't really good enough, because you might still have gum stuck on the blade. And there are a few biologicals that people have tried, but to be honest, in the UK we have Serenade, which is Bacillus subtilis, and that in other countries has been used during blossom time in response to Fireblight warnings, but it's not a cure-all. It may have some effect, and it would only ever be used as part of a programme. The most important thing is the monitoring the situation, looking out for infection and cutting it out. So I don't really think at this stage it's worth saying anything about biologicals or anything like that. They use them in some other countries, but they usually use them in conjunction with antibiotics and other forms of control. But basically in this country we're down to monitoring orchards for the infection and cutting it out as soon as possible. I think that's all.